Well, thank you very much for that invitation, and thank you for including me in your conference. It's always exciting to be part of a conference in another country, because even though we're all concerned in some ways about the same things, we all go about it differently, and we all think about it differently. And so even as a speaker, I often learn a great deal from my participation in a conference such as this. And of course, it's very exciting to be in Buenos Aires. I was here once before, and it's very exciting to see the changes that have happened in the intervening 12 years or so. The topic of my presentation this morning is research results on immersion programs in Canada. So in keeping with one of the themes of the conference on identity, I'll talk about my own identity first of all. I come to you as a researcher who does research on various forms of bilingualism and bilingual education, and I'm going to talk to you about research findings, but I promise I'll try to make it interesting and not too boring, not too much data, and I will try to do it in a way that is relevant to the kinds of work that you are all involved with. But it might be just useful for me to know who you are actually, not individually, of course. But how many of you teach in the primary school level? How many of you teach at the secondary school level? Oh, most of you. That's interesting. How many of you are school administrators? A few of you. How many of you are teacher trainers? Oh, a lot. Okay. Okay, so that's interesting to know. How many of you work in a bilingual program of some sort or another? Okay, a handful of you. Okay. So that's information that's useful for me to have so that I can tailor some of my comments as we go along. I want to start off by building on what Christina talked about and by situating my comments on immersion and put it into a global perspective. As Christina pointed out, education is subject to various changes over time, and clearly the most obvious change that's going on around us that influences what we do is globalization, and I probably don't even need to say that. But I want to use globalization as a context for talking about the kinds of learners that I'm concerned about. You'll see that the data that I'm going to share with you today is data on children who are in bilingual programs, and these are children who speak the majority language of the community in which they live and in which they're educated. So in Canada, this is really English-speaking children who are in bilingual programs where they're learning another language, usually French. And this is an important group of children because we tend to think of bilingual education for learners who do not speak the majority language. We tend to think of bilingual education for students who speak a minority language and they have to learn the majority language. But my concern is actually for children who already know a majority language, and in fact, they know the sort of mother of all majority languages, English. And globalization is relevant even for this group of children, however. And one of the slides that I've put up here and one of the comments that Christina made was that even though English is a global language and that it's used globally and it's important in very different spheres of life, the data are suggesting that already there are more second language speakers of English than there are native speakers of English. So what this means for a community such as the one that I live in is that, sure, English is an important language to know, and if you only knew one language, perhaps English would be the most important one to learn because it is a global language. But these data, these statistics are also indicating that knowing English is not enough, because there are all these people out there who not only speak English, but they speak other languages. They speak Spanish, they speak Portuguese, they speak Chinese. So if you're a monolingual speaking parent or a monolingual speaking child, knowing English is great, but you really need to know other languages if you're going to take advantage of globalization and in a professional sense be able to compete in the global marketplace. So even for children who are speaking a majority language, such as English or in your country Spanish, knowing another language is very, very important. But there's a flip side to this issue, and that is that if bilingualism is good for speakers of the majority language, it's also good for speakers of a minority language. So children who in Canada do not speak English or French, or children in Argentina who do not speak Spanish, maintaining these children's bilingualism as they learn the national language is important, so that they too will benefit from bilingualism within this global world that they're growing up into. So perhaps consistent with the theme of this conference, I'm not going to deal directly with the theme of language, culture, and identity, but an underlying theme of what I'm going to talk about is that bilingualism is good for everybody, whatever your cultural identity is, whether it's a member of a minority group or a member of a majority group. But the way we achieve bilingualism within the school context may be different, because learners of a minority language are quite different from learners of a majority language, not cognitively so much, but socioculturally. And we need to take those sociocultural factors into account. I will throw in the odd comment about this as I go along. And while it's an underlying theme of my presentation, it's not a theme that I'm going to be discussing directly. So what are my goals? I want to describe the Canadian immersion programs for you. And then I want to summarize in a very brief way the kinds of results that we have obtained from these programs. The focus of these data is on children who have been in programs that are offered at the primary elementary level, but there's also data that we have from students who are in immersion programs at the secondary school level. And what I want to do is, after I presented those results in a very brief way, is I would like to discuss what these results mean in terms of program development and in terms of curriculum development and teaching. So the focus of my comments is really on the learners. What is it that we know about learners in these programs, and what does that tell us about what we as professionals, either in the classroom or designing programs, what is it that we might learn from this in order to create more effective learning environments for these students? So I'm going to, as I go through this, discuss what I believe is some of the implications for teaching and learning. But because I'm a researcher and not a frontline teacher like you are, I'm inviting you to think critically about what I'm saying, to question what I'm saying, if it's useful, to accept what I'm saying, but to allow some of these findings to let you think differently about the things that you all already think about. Okay, what is immersion? And this is an important concept to grasp, because in educational fields, often the same term or concept gets used in lots of different ways, and it's important that we have the same understanding of what I'm talking about, so that when we're talking about immersion, we know what it is. Otherwise, we might be using this term in very different ways, and so we're really not going to make sense of one another. These are programs that, as I've already said, that are intended for students who are members of the majority group in which they're educated. So in Canada, this is English-speaking children who are in a program where another language is being used for instructional purposes. In Argentina, it would be children who already speak Spanish, and they might be in a program where English is used for instruction or something else. And this is very important. What I'm describing here is not necessarily an approach for educating children bilingually if they come from a minority language background, such as an indigenous language group in Argentina or South America, or for immigrant children who might migrate to Argentina from outside South America, and so on. In these programs, what is very distinctive about these programs is that the second language of the learners is used for at least 50% of the academic instruction that these students receive for at least 1 year, and usually 2 or more years. I'm going to show you some graphic representations of these programs that will make this easier for you to understand. But what is important at this point to grasp is that in these programs, the target language is taught as a language, but most importantly, the target language is used as a medium of instruction of non-language subjects. So these students are being taught mathematics and science in their second language. They're not necessarily being taught those subjects in their native language. So that was the radical departure in these programs. And I'm going to go into that in a little bit more detail in a moment. But the target language, the second language, is also used for social communication among the children in the classroom and outside class, but also between the students and their teachers. So the target language is being used not only for academic instruction, but also for social communication within certain domains within these students' day-to-day lives in school. Now, I want to clarify how the term immersion relates to another term that's widely used these days, but there seems to be a lot of confusion about how this term and immersion relate. Within the European context, European educators and researchers have coined a term called CLIL, Content Language Integrated Learning. Does anybody not know what this is? Okay, everybody knows what that is, or everybody thinks they know what it is. I'm not sure that anybody really knows what it is, quite frankly, because there's a lot of confusion over it. But because CLIL is actually a very broad term that can apply to lots of different second and foreign language contexts. But to a large extent, CLIL classrooms are the same as immersion classrooms if the CLIL language is being used for academic instruction. So if you've read about CLIL and you've read articles that says that CLIL is not immersion, strictly speaking, that's not true. There are forms of CLIL which are essentially the same as immersion, okay? So that's just to show you that there are these terms that actually mean the same thing. Another term that's widely used that can also apply to immersion and CLIL is content-based instruction, language instruction. In fact, all of these, immersion, CLIL, all of these, in my opinion, are examples of content-based instruction where you're using non-language content to teach the language. So I'm going to use the word immersion, but in many cases you could consider calling this a CBI classroom or a CLIL classroom. So what are the goals of immersion programs? In a nutshell, immersion programs are like any other school program. They aim for normal levels of first language development in the children, English in our case. They also aim for normal levels of academic achievement in non-language domains. So these kids are expected to achieve the same levels of competence in math and science or physics and chemistry as kids in a regular English program. But at the same time, they're expected to acquire advanced levels of functional competence and proficiency in the second language. And in many cases, the programs aim for understanding and appreciation of not only the students' native culture, but of the second language culture. So these are programs which have the same expectations as any school program, with the addition that the students will also acquire advanced levels of functional proficiency in French and some understanding and appreciation for another culture, and hopefully they'll also acquire some competence to interact in that other culture. So it's what we would in English call value-added education, because they go into a school system, they're getting what everybody else is getting, but they're getting something in addition, okay? So this is often a popular notion for parents that they're getting more out of the education system in immersion than they would in a regular program. Now, the immersion programs are often thought to have originated in Canada, and in some senses they were. The reality is that teaching children through a second language or a foreign language has existed for hundreds, if not thousands of years during the Greek Empire and the Roman Empire. I won't bore you, but you know, whenever the Romans went in and conquered another country, the children who got educated at that time were being educated in a second language, Latin. They weren't educated in English or French or German, whatever the local language was. So this form of education actually has been around for a long time. In the modern era, it's often attributed to Canadian immersion programs, which date back to about 1965. Now, these are very interesting programs in a general sense, because they have been adapted all over the world to meet the local needs and expectations of the local community. And I want to give you just some examples of this so that you understand that while I'm going to talk about Canadian immersion programs, they actually have been implemented in countries around the world for somewhat different reasons. And in many cases, these programs in other countries around the world have been evaluated. And the results that I'm going to share with you this morning are consistent with results that people have found in different settings. So these findings are not specific to Canada. Sometimes I gave a very similar lecture on this in Istanbul in May, and at the end of the lecture, the head of the department said, "Well, this is all very good for Canada, but this really isn't going to work here." So I realize I have to make people understand better that a lot of the research comes out of Canada, but there's a lot of research on these programs in other countries, and the findings are remarkably consistent for the most part. So they're very adaptable and they're very useful in lots of different communities with some adaptations. So there's programs like the program in Canada which are intended to serve national policy. So in Canada, the French Immersion program was put in place and is popular because Canada is an officially bilingual country, and English-speaking parents in Canada send their children to French immersion programs because they want their children to learn the other official language, okay? But there's a lot of immersion programs that exist in programs which are not in countries which are not officially bilingual, such as the United States, Estonia, Japan, but where the parents of the children in the program want their children to learn other important local or regional languages. So in the United States, for example, there are Spanish immersion programs. And these are programs for English-speaking children, majority language children, who study some of their school subjects through the medium of Spanish. These parents want their children to learn Spanish along with English because Spanish is widely spoken around the world. I think we heard the figure, was it 15 million or 50 million? But it's a very large number of Americans are Spanish speakers. But of course, Spanish is an extremely important world language. It's probably number 3 or 4 in the list of world languages. So these are parents who want their children to have the benefits of knowing English and this other important local and international language. The case of Japan is interesting because in the United States, there are programs for English-speaking children which are in Japanese. So these children are going to school, they're studying in English and in Japanese because these parents want their children to learn Japanese. It's an important language in Asia. And there's also English immersion programs in Japan. So these are Japanese-speaking children who go to school and they get educated in English and Japanese. And these are for parents who want their children to, of course, learn Japanese and learn to read and write in Japanese, but they also want them to learn to be competent in English. So here you have programs that are not serving official language policies, but they're meeting the needs of parents who want enriched, or if you like, value-added education for their children. There are, as I've just said, there are programs where the languages that are involved are very similar, English and French, English and Spanish, for example. But there's also programs where the languages are radically different from one another. So Japanese and English, very different languages, written differently, different grammars, different phonology. There's programs in Estonian and Russian in Estonia, radically different languages. So, and there's been research on these programs. And what I'm going to describe to you in a moment applies to these programs as well as it does to research which was done in programs where there's languages which are very similar. We also have programs in Canada and in the United States where the second language is a heritage language. So for example, in the US, there are programs in Chinese immersion programs. The children these are children of Chinese descent. They speak English at home. They've been assimilated to the American way, but their parents want them to acquire or maintain Chinese because it is a heritage language. And these kinds of programs also exist in Canada, where there's Hebrew immersion programs, Mohawk immersion programs. And finally, there are indigenous language programs, which I think might be particularly relevant here. These are for children who actually speak English in Montreal, for example, or in the US, because their parents' generation has lost the indigenous language. Let's say it's Mohawk or Cree or Inuktitut. But their parents want them to reacquire the indigenous language, the heritage language, because it's part of who they are. Their identity as Mohawks is intimately tied up with knowing Mohawk, but they don't know Mohawk. But it's also a program that's valued because it's seen as a way of salvaging or saving the Mohawk language, which is at risk of extinction if this generation of children do not acquire the language. So I'm sure that this is relevant for indigenous language groups in Argentina and South America, where a lot of the indigenous languages are probably under threat of loss because these children are increasingly learning Spanish or Portuguese, and it becomes, and immersion is a way for these children to maintain the indigenous language as they also acquire the dominant societal language. So there's lots of variations on these programs. What is the rationale behind these programs? Maybe what I'll do is actually fast forward and show you a program and then give you the rationale. So here's what's called an early total immersion program. This is a kindergarten in our system where the children are about 5 years of age. They enter school for the first time. And the red bars is how much instruction these children get in French, their second language. And these kind of green bars or blue bars is how much instruction they get in English. So there are a number of things, and this is what percentage. So what you'll notice here is that these are English-speaking children, and for the first 3 years, kindergarten, grade 1 and grade 2, all of their instruction is in French. They learn to read and write in French before they learn to read and write in English. They learn math in French, they learn science in French, social studies in French. Everything is in French. The teacher only uses French all of the time, and the children slowly start to use French all of the time themselves. Starting in grade 3, when the children are about 7 or 8 years of age, they get some English language instruction for about an hour a day. Usually this is literacy instruction, English language arts instruction. And then starting in grade 4, they start to get some subjects taught in English. So they might get math in English and science in French and so on. And so by the end of grade 6, the end of elementary school, when the children are about 11 or 12 years of age, half of the curriculum is taught in English and half is taught in French, okay? So that's a very popular program. We have 300,000 children in Canada are basically in this kind of a program. So what you can see is that this is a radical departure from the education that they would normally have, in that they're getting all of their primary education, through the medium of French. Now, what's the rationale behind this? Why do we do this? Because these programs kind of are counterintuitive to many people. Many people think that we should be educating these children in their native language because this is the language they know, so it's going to be easier for them to learn to read and write. It's going to be easier for them to do math and science and so on in English. Why are we doing this to them in French? Well, part of the rationale for this research is that, or these programs is that we don't really understand fully how children acquire a language, their first language even, but we know that virtually all children, with a few pathological exceptions, acquire a first language relatively effortlessly, not so quickly actually, but they acquire full proficiency in that language if they're in an environment where the target language is being used for extended periods of times and in meaningful and authentic ways. And obviously what this tells us, and we know this from other research, that children, when children are born, they have an innate capacity for language learning that no other species of animal has. We don't know exactly what that capacity is comprised of, but we know that children have it and no other animal species has it. And it allows them to learn language in a very natural and complete fashion. So in effect, in immersion programs, what we're trying to do is create that kind of natural language learning environment in a school context, which will allow these children to learn their language using this innate natural language learning ability they have. So we're really not teaching the language so much as we're giving them an opportunity to learn it using whatever natural abilities they have. Part of the rationale is also related to this, and that is that we know that young children learn language most effectively by using it. So to learn a language is to use a language. Using language is learning a language. So in the immersion context, again, the teachers are using the language all the time to teach math, science, and so on. And the students are similarly expected to use the language when they have enough competence in it, because by using it, the children will acquire the language. The problem with traditional second and foreign language programs is that students get very few opportunities to actually use the language, because usually it's the teacher who's doing most of the talking. So in immersion, the focus is on the learner and giving the learner the opportunity to use the language and thereby to learn the language. Now, a final rationale behind these programs, at least in Canada, was the idea that when you have young children, that they have a kind of openness to other languages and other cultures that facilitates language acquisition. So in a sense, what we're saying here is that you take these children, they come from English language families, English is used on a day-to-day basis, they come to school, all of a sudden the teacher is speaking a language they don't know, she's from a different cultural background, isn't this going to create a problem? And the argument is no, because these children don't have the same sociocultural expectations. They don't have the same biases as adults have. The adults may have biases against French or against the politics which is in the community that involves language. But these children are young. They're open to experiences, and as long as they like their teacher, they're going to do whatever she wants them to do, and they're going to want to communicate with her in whatever language she is using. So in a kind of simplified way, this is really the rationale behind these programs. So I'm laying that out now just so you understand why these programs make sense. I'll now give you the research results, but I want to come back to this rationale because people are now questioning whether this rationale is 100% correct. So there's early immersion. There's different models of immersion. Here's what we call partial immersion. So again, kindergarten to grade 6. The kids are approximately 5 years of age to 12 or 13. In this program, half of the curriculum is taught in the second language and half is taught in English. The same subjects are not taught in both languages. So if they're getting math in French here, they're not getting math in English at the same time. They might get math in English later on, but they don't get a double dose of math, once in English and once in French, okay? What they do get a double dose of is language arts. So they get English language arts and they get French language arts. They learn to read and write in French more or less at the same time in every grade level. Okay, so that's called partial immersion. Here's a program called delayed immersion. So the kids get FSL, like ESL, but it's French second language, in the first 4 years. And then in grade 4, they get half of their curriculum taught in French and half in English. This is not a very common program, but it has been tried. Here's an interesting program. This is called 2-year late immersion. This is now grade 7. It's the first year of secondary school in our system. Children are about 12 or 13 years of age. They've already gone through elementary school. And 80% of their secondary 1 and secondary 2 curriculum is taught in French. Everything is taught in French, as it normally would be taught in English, physics, chemistry, whatever, history, geography. It's in French instead of English, and they get some English language instruction. It's usually literature or drama or something like that, okay? Then when they get into grades 9, 10, and 11, they continue to get up to 40% of their high school subjects are taught in French by native French speakers using French language textbooks, and the remainder of the curriculum is taught in English. So these are interesting variations that are interesting to different communities, which we'll talk about in a moment. But also these different variations in these programs allow us to ask some interesting questions about, well, is it better to start early, or can we achieve the same results if the students don't start until grade 7? What happens if they get more exposure or less exposure? Is more exposure better than less? Okay? So this is where research is very useful, because it allows us to actually test some of the assumptions that we hold about language learning and language teaching. And after more than 40 years of experience with this, it's been my experience that most of the assumptions we have about second language learning and teaching are wrong. They don't have support from scientific evidence. So I want to share some of that with you. So this is what the research looks like. This is as technical as I'm going to get. The focus of the research is on students who are in immersion programs. Now remember, these are kids who are in English speakers at home, and they're studying through French. We have 2 comparison groups. This is a group of children who also speak English, so it's an L1 comparison, and they're in an English-only program. All of their instruction is in English, but they get some FSL, maybe 45 minutes a day from kindergarten. And here we're interested in looking at the children's, to see whether these immersion children acquire the same level of competence in English as kids who are in an all-English program. Do they acquire the same level of competence in their academic subjects? And how do they do in the second language? There's a second comparison group we call the L2 comparison group. These are children who speak French as a native language, which is it's the second language of these students. And here we're primarily interested in seeing how good are these students in French in comparison to students who speak French as a second language. So this is a benchmark that we're comparing these kids against. Because in Quebec, there's more French speakers than English speakers, and we want to see whether these native English speakers, how close do they get to being native-like, okay? So here's the research questions I'm going to discuss with you. It actually goes very quickly because the results are very consistent. The first question is, what happens to these students' English language outcomes? And the fear has always been that if you take an English-speaking child and you put them into a bilingual program like this, where up to 50% or more of their instruction is in French, that their English language skills are going to suffer because they're getting less instruction in English. What actually happens? And we've done years and years of research on this. We've looked at their speaking skills, listening skills, reading and writing skills in English. And what we've consistently found is that the immersion students do just as well as in English as students in an all-English program. So even though these students are getting, in the first three or 4 years, no English instruction, when we evaluate their English language skills at the end of elementary school, there's no difference between these groups. So this is one of these situations where our assumption is that these kids are going to fall behind, and when you actually look at the evidence, we don't find support for that. That's been found not only in Canada, it's been found if you look at English kids in Spanish immersion in the United States. It's been true even if you look at Japanese-speaking children in English immersion programs in Japan. These kids do not fall behind in Japanese, even though Japanese is an entirely different language. So for these majority language students, there is no risk there to their native language development over the long run, even though they're getting much less instruction in English. So a related question is, and again, this is sort of, there's always been this assumption, if the students, English-speaking students, get more instruction in the native language, that they will be better than students who are getting less instruction in the native language. Makes sense, right? And in school, we like to think that the more we do something, the better the students will be, but is that actually true? And we also want to know, within the context of native language development, what happens to students who are native speakers of English, but they have poor native language skills? Because it's often assumed that these kinds of programs are not suitable for students who have poorly developed native language skills, and in fact, they may even be at risk for language impairment in the native language, and the assumption is we should keep these kids out of the program, okay? What actually happens? Well, what we find, and I won't give you all the data because it's quite simple, is that more instruction in the native language and earlier instruction in the native language does not result in better English language performance in the long run than less instruction or later instruction. So beginning in early immersion doesn't result in poorer English language results than doing a delayed immersion or a partial immersion. So these students' native language skills are very robust in the face of the reduction in native language instruction that they're getting, okay? So you might ask yourself, how is that possible? How could you take a child who's an English speaker, spend the first 4 years teaching them to read and write and do everything else in French, and at the end of grades 5 and 6, you look at their English and they're doing just as well as children who have been in English from the beginning? This doesn't make sense. These English teachers are not doing their job because the kids should be doing better in the English program because everything's in English, but we're not finding this. Somebody's to blame. It must be the teachers. And this is what people were thinking in the beginning, because to go back, just to highlight this for you, sorry, this is students who were in this program where everything is in French in the beginning. They were not doing any better in English at the end of grades 5 and 6 than students in this program, even though these students are getting a lot more English, nor were they doing any better in English than students who were not getting any immersion until secondary school. They were all doing equally well at the end when they started to all get English instruction. So what's going on? So let me try and fast forward here. What's going on? Well, one of the things that's going on, and we now have a good scientific evidence for this, and this was a notion that was introduced many years ago by Jim Cummins, is that when students learn one language, their competence, if they learn a second language, their competence in the other language helps them. So in this case, and this is a concept that we would call bootstrapping. So these are linguistic boots. And in this case, the students are trying to learn English, their first language, but all of their instruction has been in French. And the bootstraps are their French language skills. So the skills that they've acquired in French help them to acquire reading and writing skills in English. They don't have to start to learn to read and write from scratch from the beginning. They already know how to read and write in French, their second language, and a lot of those skills transfer or help them learn reading and writing skills in English much more easily. And it makes sense. And you know, most teachers will tell you, if you're working with bilingual children or second language learners, children only have to learn to read once. Once they know how to read, they know how to read, and what the task is to figure out how you apply those reading skills that you already know to another language that you're starting to learn. All right? And this makes a lot of sense because these kids may have two languages, but they've only got one brain. And those two languages live in the same brain. And those two languages are talking to one another, not literally, but they're interacting in some ways. So skills they acquire in French, or English for that matter, are going to be applied in the service of learning the same kinds of skills in another language. It's like any kind of skill. If you play racquetball, if you play tennis, for example, you've acquired certain skills for playing various kind of racket sports. And then learning another racket sport will be easier for you because you have certain skills that are common to all racket sports. There are some skills that are unique to tennis versus badminton versus whatever, but there's a lot of it that's common. And so it's people who are learning it for the first time that have trouble. People who already can play a racket sport can transfer a lot of those skills. So what is it that actually transfer? And we could do a whole morning on this, but these are the kinds of language skills which research has found transfer. So a lot of these are skills that are related to literacy, which is very good news in the school context. So language skills, print-related skills transfer across languages. Knowledge of the alphabetic principle, that letters correspond to sounds in the language, that kind of knowledge transfers. You have to figure out what the correspondence is, but just knowing that these black squiggles refer to a sound, that's the big breakthrough for young readers and writers. Phonological awareness transfers, decoding skills transfer, vocabulary skills transfer, and so forth and so on. In other words, kids who are good at these skills in their second language acquire the same kinds of skills very quickly in their first language, and vice versa. So this should be a two-headed arrow. And we know there's a lot of evidence to support this finding. So we know that these kids maybe don't fall behind in English, even though they've had much less instruction in English, because what they've learned in French can be applied to learning to read and write and think, for that matter, in English. Okay? There's some savings that's achieved by being good at the second language. So what happened, going on, what happens to these children's academic skills? Have to find my wine. So the fear here is that if you teach these young children math, science, social studies in French, they may not acquire competence in those areas as readily as children who are acquiring those concepts and skills and knowledge in English. What actually happens, and again, years and years of research in Canada and everywhere else shows that the immersion students do just as well as the non-immersion students in math, science, and even at the secondary level, if you look at physics, chemistry, advanced history, advanced geography, even though they're being taught that knowledge in the second language, it will be transferred into English. They might have a little bit of trouble talking about it in English because they don't know all the terminology, but they have the concepts. Okay? I won't go into this, but some people find this hard to believe. All I can tell you is Canadian students do it without any problem. So if our students can do it, students in other countries can do it as well. Finally, and this is really the most intriguing part of it, is what happens to these students' second language skills. And in the beginning,